What makes a country a country? What is the difference between a tribe and a nation? While the answer to this question isn't set in stone, most people would agree that a nation is a certain landmass inhabited by a certain people with a certain culture. There are many examples in the world of what a nation is and how they came to be, but the region of South America in particular serves as a fascinating case study on how nations are born. In the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, the collapse of the Spanish Empire had left behind a patchwork of generalships and jurisdictions that were essentially small-scale empires. And much like the Spanish Empire before them, they too broke apart into smaller, separate nations. But the creation of some of these nations was more the result of historical circumstances, rather than an inevitable outcome. Some countries succeeded in breaking away, whilst others tried and failed. And what's interesting to note is that, had they succeeded, today we would consider them a nation of their own, even though in this timeline they are a part of another one. And so we must ask the question, are nations something inherent or something created? In this video, I would like to argue that nations are both created by cultures, but also born of political circumstances. And to do so, I will be using a case study, the very first nation-state in the Americas. Sitting between the Amazon forest and the Pilcomayo River lies a country unlike any other. Paraguay is more than your average guy. Stretching at approximately 406,000 square kilometers, Paraguay is not a small country by any means, though it might appear so when compared to its neighbors. It is a landlocked country that, nevertheless, still has intensive maritime activity through its two border rivers, and is far less salty about it than a certain other landlocked nation. It is a nation-state with a very strong sense of identity and culture, a culture that is deeply tied to its indigenous ancestry. Between 70 to 80% of the population is mestizo and have indigenous roots, and around 80% can speak the native indigenous language, the Guarani. Paraguay is both effectively and officially a bilingual country. Guarani is recognized as an official language by its constitution. It is taught in schools as per a mandatory school curriculum, and in 2010 it even got Latinized into a written script, with a new language academy overseeing its development. And this widespread integration of indigenous culture into society, which to many seems like a fun little detail, is something very unique to Paraguay in a Latin American context. Most countries in Latin America spend most of their time either denying their indigenous ancestry or actively suppressing and erasing their indigenous past. And so, in more ways than one, Paraguay stands out as a unique society in its makeup and its culture. But to see how exactly this historical development came to be, we have to turn the clock back thousands of years to the very first people to arrive in the region. Between 28,000 to 10,000 years ago, the first humans are thought to have arrived in the American continent. It is generally agreed that during the last cold period of the Earth, the waters of the Bering Strait froze into a glacial bridge which human tribes in Siberia used to cross into America. Afterwards, most of these tribes were stuck in the Alaska region due to the existence of massive ice sheets that prevented migration south, though a recent theory suggests that some of these tribes circumvented the problem by using canoes, though evidence of that is somewhat limited. Nevertheless, around 10,000 years ago, those ice sheets melted, and the tribes that settled there were free to disseminate into the rest of the continent. Generally speaking, they migrated south following the coastline, as the overhunting of the animals that crossed with them meant that hunter-gatherers had to become fishermen to survive. They crossed the areas of California, Mexico, and later Panama, until finally making their way into South America proper. And this is when the migratory tribes diverged into two main groups. The first group continued hugging the coastline and later followed the Andes Mountains, making rapid headway into the southernmost reaches of the continent, whilst the second group began migrating through the lowlands, that being the deep forests and jungles of the Amazon region. These people were hunter-gatherers and later fishermen. They continued their movement by either following the various affluents of the Amazon River or by covering certain distances on foot. Eventually, they would reach the edges of the Amazon grasslands and travel across the Mato Grosso Plateau. And very soon, these people would arrive into the region where our story is mainly concerned about. According to the anthropologian Irada Vargas, pre-Columbian Indian societies were divided into three main classes: hunter-gatherer societies, tribal societies, or classic-theocratic societies. The societies that arrived into Paraguay proper were firmly of the first two categories. Around 6,000 years ago, the first people were thought to have arrived into the Paraná region, and these tribes were in all likelihood hunter-gatherer groups coming from the Amazon, the Proto-Amazonians. These people were originally hunters and fishermen, but over time and during their migration, they started adopting agricultural practices more and more, until finally settling in the Oriental region of Paraguay near the Paraná River. Between 2000 to 1500 years ago, archaeological records of ceramic artifacts enter the timeline, which means that either the Proto-Amazonians learned ceramics or they were displaced by a people who already had the practice. Neither of these theories has been confirmed so far, but in the end it doesn't really matter, because afterwards a second, more important wave of migrants coming from the deepest reaches of the Amazon arrived in the region, the Ava Amazonians, also known as the Proto-Guarani. When the Proto-Guarani started arriving at the Paraná Basin, they didn't do so as a unified group, but rather as several distinct tribes who had similar languages. Unlike the nomad migrations of the late Roman Empire, rushed and almost like an invasion, the migrations of the Proto-Guarani were very slow and extended over hundreds of years. The first to arrive were the Proto-Mbia, subsistence farmers who came in small communities and were generally exclusive to all outsiders. Whether they arrived in the region as settlers or conquerors isn't exactly clear, but what we do know is that once they arrived, they stayed. Then came the Proto-Carians, a group of large tribal communities who specialized in more intensive farming techniques. They lived in villages to support their greater population and were generally more open to outsiders. Over many centuries, these two groups would become closely connected with each other, and because of this, the diet of the natives started to change from a fish-based diet to one dominated by corn and cassava. But in spite of developing such intensive farming techniques, the Proto-Guarani never became a settled people like in Mesoamerica. The societies of the Guarani lived in almost semi-nomadic life cycles, with the tribe constantly searching for new fertile land after the last had been used and left behind. And in this process, the tribal shamans played a key religious role in organizing and encouraging the Oguata to migrate and the Marandeco to wage war. The shamans of the tribe were revered as prophets and magicians and held a position of power through their religious role in the community. Centuries down the line, this leader figure would be essential in the construction of a national identity for Paraguay. But so far, we've only talked about tribes to the east of the Paraguay River, because to the west, things were very different. For the longest time, the Paraguayan Chaco was a semi-arid wasteland where no one lived in. It is possible that people passed through it, but nobody made a home of it until 1,000 years ago with the arrival of various tribes who adopted a nomadic lifestyle to survive this environment. The Mataco tribes coming from the north, the Guaycuru tribes coming from the southeast, and the Samuco tribes coming from further up north, probably as refugees from an Arawak invasion. All of these people were the first settlers of the region, and unlike the Guarani tribes in the Oriental region, who were staunch isolationists due to their culture and geography, the natives of the Chaco region were deeply integrated into a wider indigenous trade network to the north, mainly through the Incas. Another key difference between the Occidental tribes and the Orientals was that these tribes never managed to create a mythology over their shared ancestry. Because of this, the linguistic map of the Chaco would remain a mixed bag, and the tribal dynamics between competing hunter-gatherer groups would be characterized by violence. Occasionally, however, these tribes would band together on a single cause, namely to raid and plunder the Guarani settlements to the west. This would create a culture of enmity between the two that would last for a very long time. In the following centuries, the natives of the region would continue the dynamics of migration and warfare practically uninterrupted, left for themselves in almost complete isolation. That is, until the turn of the 16th century, which would see the arrival of a new people that would change the fate of the region forever. This is the first part of a two-part video. In the first part, I had to cut it in half because time constraints, The next part will probably come out in a few months, hopefully. I was originally hoping to publish this in a single go, but apparently I'll have to cut it in half. It's unfortunate, but it is what it is. At any rate, please be patient, and I hope to see you all in the next one.